I didn't understand sending me back. Why? Why would anyone leave a place like this? There is a message you must deliver, he continued, his voice steady but heavy, with sorrow, a message for the world. And then I saw him, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Imagine dying, leaving this world, and standing in the presence of Jesus, only to be sent back with a message so urgent, so world-changing that it could alter humanity's future. This is the true story of Mary Jones, a 70-year-old woman who defied death, returned to life, and brought back a warning for us all. What she saw and who it involves will leave you speechless. Watch until the end to hear the message that shapes the fate of our world.
The hospital room was heavy with tension, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and quiet desperation. I could hear the machines beeping steadily, though each sound felt distant, as if it belonged to another world. My daughter, Susan, sat beside me, her warm hand clutching mine like it was her lifeline. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was going to be okay, but my strength was slipping away faster than I could muster the words. Her voice broke through the haze, trembling and soft. "Mom, please, hang on," she whispered. I could feel the fear in her grip, her fingers trembling against my frail skin. Tears streaked down her face, glistening in the pale light of the room. My heart ached for her, for the pain I was leaving behind. Ethan, my grandson, paced the room in anxious circles, the squeak of his sneakers against the tiled floor, a faint reminder of his helplessness. Caleb, my quieter grandson, stood by the window, his back to me. He didn't want to see this, couldn't bring himself to face the inevitable. I wanted to tell him it was okay to look, to say goodbye, but the words wouldn't come. My breaths were too shallow, the pull of peace stronger than the pain that tethered me to this life. The machine slowed. The rhythmic beeping, so constant before, began to fade. Susan's sobs grew louder, sharper. "Mom, I love you. Please don't leave us." Her voice cracked, a sound so raw it cut through my failing senses. And then, silence. The world fell away. There was no pain, no sound, no fear. Just stillness. I wasn't falling into darkness as I'd once imagined. Instead, I felt an all-encompassing peace, like a warm embrace that erased every worry, every regret. I was free, but this was not the end. Even as I drifted further from the world I'd known, I realized my journey wasn't over. There was something waiting for me, something greater than I could have imagined. I didn't know it then, but what lay ahead would change everything. The first thing I felt was warmth. It wasn't the kind of warmth you get from sunlight or a fire. This warmth seeped into my very being, wrapping around my soul like an embrace I didn't know I needed. It started as a faint glow, distant but inviting, growing brighter and more vibrant with every moment. Colors appeared, colors I'd never seen before, vivid and alive, blending in ways my earthly mind couldn't comprehend. I stood there, bathed in the light, my heart swelling with emotions I couldn't name. Love, joy, peace. It was all of those things and more. Tears streamed down my face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of it all. I didn't feel afraid. For the first time in years, I didn't feel pain. I felt whole, and then I sensed it, a presence. I didn't need to see him to know who it was. The very air around me carried his essence, a mix of power, peace, and sorrow. My knees trembled as Jesus appeared before me, his radiance beyond anything I had ever imagined. He wasn't the distant figure I'd seen in paintings or church windows. He was alive, and his light came from within, as if he were the source of all that surrounded me. His eyes met mine, and I felt my soul laid bare. He saw everything, my joys, my sorrows, my regrets, my fears, and yet there was no judgment in his gaze. Only love, infinite, unending love. It was so overwhelming that I fell to my knees, unable to stand in his presence. "Mary," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice broke something inside me. It wasn't just a word. It was an embrace, a reassurance, a calling. You are here for a moment, but your work is not done. I am sending you back. My heart sank. Why would anyone leave this place? This perfection? Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Why would you send me back? There is a message you must deliver, he said, his tone gentle but firm. A warning for the world. His gaze grew heavier, filled with a sorrow I couldn't fully understand. It concerns Benjamin Netanyahu. His choices will shape not just his nation, but the fate of humanity. Before I could respond, visions flooded my mind. I saw Israel, vibrant and alive, its people thriving under a light of unity and faith. But then, shadows began to creep in. The land became fractured, divided by greed and corruption. At the center of it all was Netanyahu, his decisions weighing heavily on the future of not just Israel, but the entire world. The sorrow in Jesus' eyes deepened as he spoke again. He stands at a crossroads, and the choices he makes will determine the path of nations. Pray for him. I wanted to ask more, to understand fully, but the light around me began to fade. The warmth, the music, the colors, all of it started to slip away, pulling me back toward the world I thought I had left behind. My heart ached, torn between wanting to stay and the urgency of the task I'd been given. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the light. I was back in my hospital bed, gasping for air, the chaos of the room crashing over me. But I wasn't the same. I had returned with a purpose, a message that could not be ignored. I stood in a place unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't earth, yet it wasn't heaven, a space that seemed to hover between worlds. Time felt strange here, both still and flowing. The light I had seen before had softened, casting a warm glow over a vast expanse that stretched endlessly before me. It didn't take long to recognize where I was. Israel, not just a nation, but a land alive with history, meaning, and divine energy. Every stone, every hill, every tree seemed to hum with purpose, as though they held secrets whispered from the beginning of time. The air was heavy with significance, and I could feel its weight pressing against my soul. Jesus stood beside me, silent at first. His gaze was fixed on the land, his expression a mix of love and sorrow. I felt his emotions as if they were my own, a deep compassion for this chosen land, tempered by a profound sadness. Finally, he spoke, his voice a blend of gentleness and authority. "Look," he said, "this is a land chosen, blessed, and set apart, but it is at a crossroads." As he spoke, the vision began to shift. I saw Israel thriving, bathed in light and unity. Its people were connected not just to one another, but to a higher purpose, leaders guided with wisdom and compassion, and the nation became a beacon of hope for the world. It wasn't just political success, it was spiritual renewal. The light of Israel spread far beyond its borders, inspiring peace and reconciliation among nations. My heart swelled with hope at the beauty of this future. But then, darkness crept in. Shadows rolled across the land like a storm, swallowing the light. I saw division and unrest spreading like wildfire. Leaders clashed, and the people grew weary, disillusioned by broken promises and corruption. The very foundations of the nation seemed to crumble under the weight of pride and greed. The harmony I had seen before was replaced by chaos, and Israel's influence turned from a force for good to a source of instability that rippled across the globe. At the center of it all stood Benjamin Netanyahu. He appeared larger than life, a commanding figure burdened by the weight of his decisions. I could see him clearly standing at a crossroads. Behind him stretched two distinct pathways, the first leading to light and harmony, the second consumed by darkness and destruction. His choices would tip the balance. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with both urgency and compassion. "His choices are being weighed in the balance," he said, his voice resonating with divine authority. "Not only for Israel, but for the world. The stakes are higher than he can imagine. His decisions must be guided by wisdom, humility, and faith, or the consequences will be devastating." I felt the gravity of what I was being shown. This wasn't just about one man or one nation. It was about humanity itself, about the spiritual and moral integrity that binds us all. The vision began to fade, but the weight of what I had seen remained. I knew that my task would not be easy. The stakes were too great, and the cost of failure was unimaginable. The scene shifted abruptly, plunging me into a room filled with tension. Benjamin Netanyahu stood at its center, surrounded by shadowy figures. Some of them appeared as advisors, their faces blurred and indistinct, their voices soft whispers in his ear. Others were darker, more menacing, their presence heavy and oppressive. These shadows didn't just exist, they consumed, their very essence draining the light around them. "These are the forces that surround him," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Some seek to guide him toward righteousness, while others aim to lead him astray." I watched as Netanyahu grappled with decisions. Papers were scattered across his desk, maps and strategies sprawled in disarray. His face was etched with exhaustion and conflict, the weight of leadership bearing down on him. The whispers around him grew louder, their competing tones blending into an overwhelming cacophony. Some voices urged caution and integrity, while others sowed doubt, fear, and greed. Jesus pointed to the scene, his tone solemn. "This is the corruption of power," he said. "It is subtle at first, a compromise here, a concession there. But soon it consumes, twisting what is righteous into what is self-serving." My heart broke as I saw Netanyahu falter under the weight of these influences. His steps grew hesitant, his decisions clouded by the pressure surrounding him. The shadows around him tightened their grip, their whispers turning into shouts, drowning out the few voices of wisdom that remained. "This path leads to ruin," Jesus said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Not just for him, but for the nation he leads and the world that watches." My gaze was drawn to the darker figures, ones that didn't just influence but seemed to manipulate, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They thrived on division and chaos, their presence a stark contrast to the few advisors who stood firm, their light unshaken. These individuals, though outnumbered, spoke calmly and steadily, urging Netanyahu to choose the path of truth and righteousness. "Pray for him," Jesus said, his voice filled with both authority and pleading. "For the choices he makes will shape the destiny of nations. He stands at a crossroads, and the path he takes will either lead to restoration or devastation." The enormity of what I was seeing overwhelmed me. The potential for light and the threat of darkness were both so vivid, so tangible. I felt the urgency of Jesus' call to action. Prayer, faith, and vigilance were not just needed. They were essential. This was a battle not just for one man or one nation, but for the soul of humanity. As the vision faded, I felt a deep resolve settle within me. I had to share what I had seen, no matter how impossible it seemed. The stakes were too high, and the time was too short. This was a message the world needed to hear. I stood on the edge of a precipice, overlooking the land of Israel. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, as though the very air shimmered with a kind of divine energy. The hills, the valleys, even the stones beneath my feet seemed to hum with purpose, alive with spiritual significance. I could feel the history of this place, its importance, its weight. And yet, there was an unease I couldn't ignore. Beside me stood Jesus. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his expression a mixture of hope and sorrow. "What you are about to see," he said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning, "are the futures that lie ahead for this nation." Before my eyes, the land began to transform. At first, I saw a vision so beautiful it made my heart swell with hope. Israel was thriving, not through military strength or political domination, but through faith, humility, and unity. Its leaders sought wisdom, not for themselves, but for their people and for the greater good. The cities bustled with life, vibrant with innovation and creativity, but they were grounded in compassion and justice. I could see how this future extended beyond Israel's borders. Nations looked to it as a guiding light, a model of resilience and moral clarity. Wars ceased, alliances strengthened, and humanity began to heal. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, but there was a deep, abiding hope. The people of Israel had embraced their role as a light to the nations, and the world was better for it. But just as quickly as the vision of light appeared, it faded. I gasped as a darker reality took its place. The land was divided, its people turning against one another, consumed by greed, mistrust, and pride. Leaders acted recklessly, chasing short-term gains while ignoring the long-term consequences. Corruption seeped into every corner of society, and the land itself seemed to wither under the weight of endless conflict and neglect. This darker vision didn't stop at Israel's borders. I saw how the unrest spread, destabilizing entire regions. Nations that had once been allies turned away, their trust shattered. Fear and division grew, choking out hope. The world became colder, more chaotic, as humanity fractured further. Tears filled my eyes, and I turned to Jesus. "What can be done?" I asked, my voice trembling under the weight of what I had seen. His gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "The choices of Israel's leaders," he said. "Their actions will shape not just this land, but the destiny of nations. Pray for them. Pray for wisdom and humility. This land has been set apart, but it must lead with faith and integrity, or the consequences will be severe." The vision darkened further, plunging me into scenes of unimaginable horror. The streets were filled with chaos, families torn apart, children crying in fear, and entire communities reduced to rubble. Fires raged across the land, their smoke rising into the sky, blotting out the sun. The air was thick with despair, the anguished cries of the people reverberating like an unending echo in my soul. I saw famine sweeping through the region. Crops withered in the fields, rivers dried to dust, and people struggled to find even the most basic necessities. Those who had once lived with plenty now scavenged for scraps, their spirits broken by the sheer weight of survival. The depth of their suffering cut into me like a knife, and I could feel their pain as if it were my own. Amidst the chaos, I saw the faces of leaders. Some were familiar, others shrouded in shadows. Their decisions only deepened the suffering. Instead of turning to faith and wisdom, they relied on political maneuvering and alliances built on greed and self-interest. Each choice seemed to drive the nation further into ruin. Jesus' voice broke through the darkness, sorrowful but steady. "This is what happens when faith is abandoned," he said. "This nation was meant to lead, to shine with my light. But when its leaders forget their foundation, when they seek power for its own sake, the people suffer, and the world feels the impact." I saw how Israel's failure rippled across the globe. Countries that had once looked to it for guidance became mired in their own struggles. Alliances fractured, and wars erupted in places that had long been at peace. Even nations far removed from Israel felt the effects. Economies destabilized, societies divided, and hope eroded. "The world is interconnected," Jesus explained. "Israel's role is not just its own. It is a cornerstone. When it thrives in faith and unity, the world is blessed. But when it falls into division and corruption, the consequences spread far and wide." I could hardly bear the weight of what I was seeing, the suffering, the despair, the lost potential. It was almost too much. Tears streamed down my face as I turned to Jesus, my heart breaking under the enormity of it all. "There is still time," he said, his voice filled with hope. "The future is not set, but the people must act. They must pray, they must repent, and they must call their leaders to account. Only then can this path of darkness be avoided." As the vision faded, I felt the weight of what I had seen settle deep into my soul. I knew the warning was clear. Israel stood at a crossroads, and its choices would determine the future, not just for itself, but for the entire world. There was no time to waste. The world's future depended on the decisions made today. I stood bathed in the light, the warmth and peace of it washing over me. My soul trembled under the weight of what I had just witnessed, the crossroads Israel faced, the futures that hung in the balance. As the visions faded, their gravity lingered in my heart like a heavy stone. Jesus stood beside me, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. His eyes, filled with love, carried a sorrow so profound it brought tears to my own. When he turned to me, I felt the full intensity of his gaze. His voice resonated not just in my ears, but deep within me, a divine vibration that seemed to settle in my very soul. "Mary," he began, his tone steady but weighted, "there is a message you must carry, and it is not one that will be easy to bear. You must speak to the heart of Benjamin Netanyahu." I froze, my breath catching in my chest. Benjamin Netanyahu? Of all the people in the world, why him? I wasn't a politician or a public figure. I was a mother, a grandmother, an ordinary woman. How could I possibly deliver a message to someone so prominent, so powerful? Fear and doubt swirled in my mind, but as I looked at Jesus, his presence quieted my turmoil. "He must lead with humility," Jesus continued, his voice unwavering, "with integrity and faith. His choices are not merely political, they are spiritual. The path he takes will determine the fate of his nation and influence the course of the world." The enormity of those words settled over me like a physical weight. I felt my knees grow weak, my spirit trembling at the thought of the responsibility being placed upon me. Why me? I wanted to ask, but before I could give voice to my doubts, Jesus spoke again. "Do not fear, for I am with you," he said, his voice filled with compassion and reassurance. "Your task is not to convince, but to share. The message must be delivered, and the rest will be left to him and to those who will listen." Tears blurred my vision as I felt the sorrow radiating from him, not just for Netanyahu, but for all of humanity. I could feel his mourning for the choices we continue to make as a people, choices driven by pride, greed, and fear. It was a sorrow that transcended time, encompassing every failure, every betrayal, every moment when we turned away from faith. "I will do it," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "Even if no one believes me, I will deliver your message." Jesus smiled, a bittersweet expression that carried both encouragement and the weight of what was to come. "Thank you, Mary. Remember, I am with you always." The light around me began to shift, its brilliance softening. The warmth and peace that had enveloped me seemed to recede, replaced by a gentle yet insistent pull. I felt it tugging at me, drawing me back to the world I had left behind. "You must go now," Jesus said softly, his voice filled with both love and finality. "There is still work to be done." I wanted to stay. The thought of leaving this place, the peace, the love, the wholeness I felt here, was unbearable. "But I don't want to leave," I whispered, my voice cracking with desperation. "It's so beautiful here." Jesus placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch radiating a peace so profound it silenced my protests. "What lies ahead will not be easy," he said, "but it is necessary. Go and tell them what you have seen. Speak the truth, no matter the cost." Before I could respond, the light around me began to fade. The music that had filled the air, the colors that had surrounded me, all of it slipped away. I felt myself being pulled back toward the weight of my earthly body, back toward the hospital room I had thought I had left behind. And then, with a gasp that echoed through the silence, I opened my eyes. The chaos of the hospital rushed in all at once. The monitors beeped frantically, their sounds sharp and jarring. Nurses and doctors flooded the room, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. My daughter, Susan, screamed, her chair scraping against the floor as she stumbled backward. "Mom? Mom?" she cried, her voice trembling with terror and disbelief. I struggled to breathe, my chest heaving as though I had been underwater for hours. Everything felt heavy, disorienting. I turned my head and saw Ethan frozen mid-step, his mouth hanging open, while Caleb stood like a statue, his face pale, as if he had seen a ghost. The doctor, Dr. Reynolds, burst into the room, his expression one of disbelief. He stared at the monitors, then at me, muttering under his breath, She was gone." I turned to Susan, my voice weak and raspy, but clear enough to carry the weight of the moment. "I'm back," I said, the words heavy with meaning. "And I have something to tell you." The urgency of the message burned within me, consuming every thought, every doubt. I knew I had been sent back for a reason, and there was no time to waste. Looking into the eyes of my stunned family, I felt the enormity of the task ahead, but also the strength to carry it out. I had a message to deliver, one that could change the course of history. Though the path would be fraught with disbelief and resistance, I knew that I had been given this moment for a purpose. The time to act was now. I sat at the kitchen table, my Bible open in front of me. My hands trembled as I traced the familiar words, seeking strength. The weight of the message burned in my heart, a fire that refused to be ignored. Doubts crept into my mind, whispering questions I couldn't silence. Who would believe me? How could I, an ordinary woman, carry such a heavy task? But Jesus' words echoed in my soul, steady and clear. Your task is not to convince, but to share. Taking a deep breath, I began with my family. Susan, Ethan, and Caleb gathered around me, their faces filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. My voice was steady despite the whirlwind of emotions within me. "I have seen him," I began. "I saw Jesus, and he sent me back with a message." The room grew quiet. I told them everything, how I had left my body, the realm of light, the overwhelming presence of Jesus. I described the visions of Israel, the crossroads facing Benjamin Netanyahu, and the dire consequences that could follow if the wrong choices were made. When I finished, Susan was the first to speak, her voice hesitant. "Mom, are you sure this wasn't just a dream? The medication, the stress, it could have..." I interrupted her gently but firmly. "It wasn't a dream, Susan. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. This message isn't just for me. It's for the world." Her silence spoke volumes, a mix of disbelief and the faint stirrings of belief. Ethan and Caleb said nothing, their expressions reflecting the weight of what they had just heard. I could see the doubt in their eyes, but I could also see something else. Hope. Determined. I expanded my reach. I wrote letters to pastors and spiritual leaders sharing my experience and pleading for their prayers. I visited local churches, speaking at gatherings both small and large. Some listened with awe, moved by the sincerity of my words. Others dismissed me as a grieving woman desperate for meaning. The mention of Benjamin Netanyahu brought its own storm. His name sparked debate wherever I spoke. Some viewed him as a visionary leader. Others saw him as polarizing and controversial. I faced accusations of seeking attention, of meddling in politics, but I pressed on, undeterred. "This isn't about politics," I said repeatedly. "It's about humanity, our values, our choices, and our faith." I urged everyone to pray, not just for Netanyahu, but for Israel and for the world. Pray for wisdom, for humility, for leaders who will guide us toward light and not darkness. I told them. The future is not set, but we must act now. Reactions were mixed. Many dismissed me, but I could see in the eyes of some that seeds were being planted. There were those who felt the stirring in their hearts, a call to action they couldn't ignore. I clung to that hope, trusting that my task was to share the message, no matter the response. As I stood before what I knew would be my final audience, I felt a strange peace despite the challenges I had faced. My story had reached far and wide, and while not everyone believed me, I knew I had done my part. The rest was in God's hands. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, their expressions ranging from skepticism to anticipation. My voice was steady, but carried the weight of everything I had experienced. The future is not set in stone, I began, letting the words hang in the air. What I saw, both the light and the darkness, are possibilities. We, as individuals and as a global community, have the power to choose. I paused, letting the silence settle over the room. Jesus' words still echo in my heart. I continued. Pray, hope, and act. The choices of leaders will shape the destiny of nations, but the prayers of the faithful can alter the course of history. I felt my voice grow stronger as I spoke. This is not just about Benjamin Netanyahu or Israel. It's about all of us. What kind of world do we want to leave behind? A world of division and greed, or one of unity and compassion? My message built to its crescendo. Pray for your leaders, whoever they are. Pray for wisdom and humility. Pray for the courage to make the right choices, even when they are difficult. And don't stop there. Act with love and integrity in your own lives. The future depends on each of us. As I prepared to leave the stage, I offered one final thought, my voice dropping to a near whisper. There are more things I saw, I said. Things I am still trying to understand. But what I know is this. The time to act is now. The window is small, but it's still open. The room was silent as I stepped back, leaving them to reflect on my words. I saw tears in some eyes, disbelief in others, but what mattered most was the sense of urgency I felt spreading through the room. As I walked away, a weight lifted slightly from my shoulders. I had done what I was sent to do. The message had been delivered. The choice now rested with the world, with the prayers of the faithful and the actions of those willing to embrace the light. The future remained unwritten, waiting for humanity to decide. This video was intense, but this video on the right-hand side is even more insane.